Welcome to Boston University's Real Estate Club Guest Speaker Series for conversations about real estate leadership management and people who have achieved something in our society. Sam Zell is certainly that, and it's an honor to have him here with us tonight. In our audience, we also have Harvard, Northeastern, Villanova, and University of Connecticut joining us. I apologize to our professors and faculty here today, but this event alone is worth more than our college tuition. I'm pleased to welcome to the virtual room, Sam Zell. Good to have you here, Sam.
My pleasure.
So you got your start in real estate when you were an undergraduate at the University of Michigan. How did that happen? And how did that inform your perspective on entrepreneurship?
Well, I've been an entrepreneur, since I was 10 years old. And, I've always been intrigued by coming up with ideas. When I went to the University of Michigan, I was never a great academic. It didn't really catch my attention. And so I ended up getting involved in, big campus activities. And one of them, I had a friend who was the general chairman. And I went over to see him one night and he said, he lived in a house. And he said the guy who owned the house had been over the night before. And he had bought the house next door and was gonna, as soon as school was over, was gonna knock both houses down and build a 15-unit apartment building. And my first reaction to my friend was, geez, why don't we go pitch him? Maybe we could manage the apartment building and we each could get a free apartment. And after all, we're students and we know what the students want. And so we put together a little brochure and we went and made our pitch. And much to our shock, they bought it. And so we took over, renting them while the building was under construction. We rented all the apartments. We just, worked out and bought all the furniture and eventually rented all the apartments. And that's how it started.
And how did you go from managing these apartments to investing in them?
Well, we ended up, the first project was in my junior year. It turned out very well. And so we ended up getting approached about another project and another project. And pretty soon we were managing, 1,000 apartments. And then there was a house that was for sale, actually 3 apartments behind this building, and I bought it for $19,500, $1,500 down, and a land contract for the balance. And I looked at the apartments, and they were grubby, and the furniture was kind of seedy, and so I basically threw out all the furniture, repainted all the apartments, bought new furniture, doubled the rents, and it worked. And that's really how I got involved in the real estate business. And, I'd like to tell you that it was some kind of esoteric conclusion, but it just seemed very simple. I mean, kind of reminds me of Abe Lincoln and his famous comment, common sense isn't so common. There's very few businesses like real estate where common sense plays such an important role and is so determinative of success.
You're considered one of the founding fathers, Sam, of today's $1 trillion REIT industry. Can you talk a little bit about the genesis of the industry? What was it like at the time and your role in it?
Well, I think that you have to go back to 1958. And in 1958, Congress passed something called the Cigar Bill. And it had some kind of regulation about cigars. I don't really remember what, but somebody added at the bottom, or in addition at the bottom of the bill, a provision that created and established the idea of a real estate investment trust, which in other words, the mantra was that you had to create an opportunity for the little old lady from Pasadena to buy a piece of big commercial real estate. And it got passed, and Ike President Eisenhower signed the bill, and the concept of a REIT was established. The fact that the concept was established didn't in any way, shape, or form guarantee its success, or even its growth. And in the ensuing years from 1958 to 1991, the entire industry grew from 0 to about 7 billion, which, considering the scale of real estate, that's a very, very slow process. And the reason was really, again, going back to Abe Lincoln's common sense. It was real simple. If you were an entrepreneur in the real estate space, it was much more attractive to run a private company than it was to run a public company in that space. And the result was that the REIT industry up until 1991 was made up of guys who used to work for insurance companies, hardly entrepreneurial, hardly focused on anything other than the preservation of the tax status of the real estate investment trust. And frankly, I think it would have, continued, like that, except like everything else in the world, necessity is the mother of invention. And in 1989, the real estate industry was in pretty horrible shape. All of the historic sources of capital for the real estate industry had disappeared. The savings and loans, were basically closed down. The banks that had been providing capital to the real estate space had a guy named Clark, who was the controller of the currency, and who in 1989, created the concept of what's your exposure to the R word. And the question was, what was the bank's exposure to real estate? And they basically shut down the market. We had mutual benefit life insurance company go broke. And all of a sudden and at the same time, over the 80s, the Japanese invaded the US real estate market, and we're significantly responsible for oversupplying it, therefore making the real estate industry even weaker. So here we were in 1990 or 1991, and all of the traditional sources of capital no longer existed for the real estate industry, with one exception. And that was the concept that you could tap the public markets and use the REIT structure that was passed in 1958 and use that as a base for building, quote unquote, liquid real estate. And in October of 1993, a couple of REITs had been taken public. And I was invited to speak to the National Association of Real Estate Investment Trusts. The meeting was in New Orleans, and the previous year, I don't know where the meeting was, but they had like 30 people came to it. And in 1993, the 30 people had grown to 1,500. And I was one of the few people in the real estate space who had ever had any experience in the public markets. And I got up there and I gave them a speech where basically I said this was a unique opportunity for the real estate space in terms of creating liquid real estate, in terms of creating a true public market in real estate. I admonished the industry and said, historically, we access the public market as a way of taking advantage of the investor. And this time, if we wanted it to continue, we were going to have to be on better behavior and do a better job of protecting the investor. The real estate, explosion that occurred was basically because there were no other options. So all of the, quote, large entrepreneurial real estate guys like me, like Mel Simon, like DeBartolo, like all of the players at the time, all had no other source of capital other than the public markets. And so it led to the creation of what we call the modern real estate arena. And basically that really translated into an industry that was run by third-rate players up until then. And it basically brought in all of the major players in real estate. And then it went from there to being $1 trillion market.
Very good. By the early 2000s, you amassed one of the largest private real estate portfolios in the country, including apartments, office buildings, and other assets, which you spun off into 3 of the industry's largest REITs: Equity Lifestyle, a manufactured housing REIT, which was an outlier. How did you get into that sector?
Well, in 1984, we've always been very focused on access to capital. And one of the things that was going on in the early 80s was the creation of limited partners and raising capital through the brokerage firms that was then invested in real estate. And we thought that it would be interesting to maybe acquire one of these companies that were basically marketing companies that raised capital. And so we looked at a bunch of them, negotiated over a bunch of possible ones, and we ended up making a deal with one, and we started the due diligence process. And we're doing the due diligence on the assets that they had bought. And the guy doing the work for me called me up and said, "Sam, I'm sitting here, I'm looking at something that I think is just unbelievable. It's the mobile home park business." And at that point, I was a major player in multifamily and office and retail, and this was just, why would anybody want to invest in that arena? And he says, "You don't understand what I'm talking about. These are extraordinarily attractive, almost single family subdivisions where you own the land and somebody rents from you and invests $80,000 or whatever the house costs on top of your land unsubordinated. And furthermore, there is a company out there that is really the dominant player in this space, and their assets are much better than the ones that we were due diligencing for buying that money raising company." And so we actually stopped buying that company and then went to work at trying to buy this company called Manufactured Housing Communities. MHC was owned by a Canadian real estate company, and it was kind of in other words, you don't get off on telling the world that you are in the mobile home park business. It's a lot more exciting if you build office buildings and big apartment buildings and big shopping centers. And so eventually they, in effect, had a loss on some stuff they built in the US, and they decided they wanted to sell the manufactured housing business so as to, quote unquote, be able to match the loss with the gain. And we went out and made an offer to buy the company. And actually, we were told that they were going to run an auction process. Well, our history of winning auctions is very, very limited. And so the result was that we tried to figure out how to change the odds. And what we did was we went ahead and did all the due diligence. And on the day that bids were required, we put an offer on the table subject to nothing with a $10 million non-refundable check. And that won the day. And that's how we got into the mobile home park business. And since that time, the only mistakes I've made in real estate are all the stuff that I didn't buy in that space.
In 2007, you sold Equity Office, the largest office building REIT, at the top of the market to Blackstone for $39 billion. It was a raging bidding war. Can you tell us about that story?
Sure. We beginning in 1989, we raised the first real estate opportunity fund. To give you and we raised the money from institutions. I had played grave dancer in real estate in the 70s, but in the 70s, institutional investors were not required to market as long as they were able to show that within 5 years they could come back to zero. So the kinds of transactions that we did were $1 down and a hope certificate, and putting up money guaranteeing, that we, keep the mortgage current in return for rewriting the debt. But when we came upon the late 80s and what we expected was going to be another enormous opportunity to buy distressed real estate, we realized that as opposed to $1 down and a hope certificate, it was going to take cash. And then we were going to be buying stuff at deep discounts, but all cash as opposed to seller financing. And so we in effect raised the first institutional fund, and that was called Zell Merrill in 1989. And we ultimately raised 4 more funds and ended up buying up a significant percentage of all of the new office buildings in America. Most of them were, underoccupied, but good real estate. We were buying real estate, and the mantra was to buy stuff at below replacement cost. And in October of 1991 or 1990, I gave a speech. And I had been writing and speaking in the 80s about, how real estate was getting oversupplied. And I said, now we had the greatest single opportunity to buy real estate that I ever saw. And that, I ended the speech by saying, you got to stay alive until 95, which became kind of the mantra of the industry. And so we kept acquiring space so that we became the largest real estate company in the world, and as we went forward, as we do with all of our public companies, at the end of every quarter, we did our own version of NAV or net asset value to kind of just assess where we were. And so that we were always, aware of, and sometimes the market gave us the opportunity to buy more stock, in the marketplace, because it was trading at what I thought was a discount to the value. And in the middle of 2006, we got an inquiry from one of the largest pension funds in the world as to whether or not we would be interested in selling equity office. Number one, the offer that they made to us was very inadequate, primarily because we kept track of what we thought the values were. And second of all, we were a little shocked because we kind of thought that, if you build a $30 billion company, it's too big for anybody to quote unquote take over. So we turned them down, and that was the end of it. And then about 3 or 4 months later, in the end of 2006, one of the investment bankers, in a heavy duty real estate investment banker, called me up and said, I know you turned down any interest, but if I really had a real buyer, what would it take to buy equity office? And I responded very quickly, and I said, it would take a Godfather offer. And he said, what do you mean by a Godfather offer? And I said, an offer that was, so significant that you just couldn't refuse it. And at that time, we had just finished an NAV of the company internally, and we came up with an NAV of 41. And the investment banker, they then came back with Blackstone offering us what have turned out to be 48. Well, at $48 a share, it became what I would refer to as a Godfather offer. It's also relevant that, when you enter the public market, you make a deal with the devil. You get access to capital, which is exciting and it gives you opportunities for growth, but you really no longer are running your own company, and you're running a company for the benefit of your shareholders. And that includes having the responsibility for making sure that you give them the optimum result. And so even though personally this was my baby and I created this company from scratch, once I became a public company, I didn't have that freedom anymore. And I responded and we made a deal to sell at 48. Subsequent to that, another party came along, and part of the key to that transaction was that I really didn't, first of all, I started out thinking that I was too big to be bought. And then I started thinking and saying, well, what we had created was truly unique, but maybe I didn't realize what it was worth. And so the condition that was a deal breaker as far as the first deal we made with Blackstone was that we would only do the deal with a $200 million breakup fee, figuring that on the $36 billion deal, $200 million was not going to discourage anybody from competing. And that assured me that other people, if they were interested out there, would have no barrier to making a bid. Well, that resulted in a competitive environment. And as the price ratcheted up from 48 to 52, and at each level of ratchet up, the breakup fee went from 200 million to 400 million to 500 million to 700 million. And the price went from 48 to 55 and a half, which was the $39 billion that we sold to Blackstone. So I didn't really think about it as tip-topping the market, and lots of people have given me what I consider to be unjustified accolades about picking the top of the market. I think I just responded to, Abe Lincoln, common sense isn't so common. If somebody is offering you 25 or 20, 30% premium to what you think it's worth, it doesn't take any genius to say yes. And that's what we did.
Really appreciate it, Sam. I love that story. You're taking it back to the beginning now. Your parents had a fascinating story of the escape from Europe in the 1940s that heavily influenced your worldview and career. Can you tell us about their journey a little bit?
Well, my parents lived on just about on the German-Polish border until August 31st, 1939, at which point, August 24th, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty was announced, which was a treaty between Russia and Germany. My father, who was in the grain business, interpreted that announcement as a divvying up of Poland, and that he needed to get as far away from Germany as possible and hopefully get to the United States. Well, at that time, the war had already begun. So going west from the German-Polish border was not an option. So he and my mother and my older sister started what turned out to be an 18-month journey from Poland across Lithuania, across the Ukraine, to cross Russia, to Vladivostok, to Japan, and then arrived in the United States in May of 1941. I was born in the end of September of 1941. So I was on the ship, but in utero. But, being, a true immigrant's child, I grew up in a pretty unusual household. My parents were extraordinarily appreciative of the fact that they were able to come to America. They were very appreciative of what it meant to be in a society where, merit was what really counted, and that there was, unlimited opportunity. And they imbued in me the idea that anything was possible in America and that I could do anything. And And I think that, that really played a role in all of the things that I've done. Many of them could best be described as not knowing that I wasn't supposed to be able to do them. There were just so many things that I did along my career that was just, from my perspective, logical. And other people responded by saying, nobody's ever done that before. Well, maybe not. But somehow or other, the fact that nobody else had done it didn't have much influence on me, just like, for whatever reason, I think because of that kind of a background, I never really got, caught up in what I'd call conventional wisdom. And so it was relatively easy for me to, go off on my own and recognize that what I needed to do was not get caught up in the noise, and that it wasn't really about being compared to others, but it was about absolute achievement. And that's what drove me. And I think, that kind of background that I came from was certainly very much contributory to my ability to do that.
You also studied to become a lawyer, but you ended up going down a different path. Could you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah, well, my father, who was a very influential person in my life, and and apropos of the story about him and my mother and my sister traveling around the world, not knowing where they were going other than they were going, he would basically say to me, I don't care what you do, but you need to have a profession. Yeah, you need to, that's what will protect you going on into the future. And since I was like a typical Jewish boy who couldn't stand the sight of blood, obviously going to medical school was not an option. So therefore I became a lawyer. And I went to law school, and I always did reasonably well in school, more out of necessity than really appetite for academics. And I felt the same. I thought law school was one of the biggest bores of my life. But I, survived it and, got through it. And then I actually thought I was going to be a lawyer. And I went out and, interviewed for jobs, and finally, after a very arduous period, was able to get a job. $5,600 a year was the compensation. And so I started working, and the first assignment I was given was to draft a contract between a linen supply company and a dormitory at a local university. And anybody who's been to law school will tell you that law school is all about learning how to think and learning how to understand the legalistic society. But there's almost nothing, particularly at a good school, they teach you nothing pragmatically. And so the idea of drafting a contract, I had no idea what to do. And I got these horn books, which are form books, and I got help from the people sitting next to me. And I like to tell people that I would submit a draft of what I was working on, and the partner who was working with me would use a red pencil and make all the corrections. And after a couple of days, it looked like I had slipped my wrists. But what became very obvious to me was that this was not what I wanted to do. And so at the end of the Friday morning of the first week, I went to see the senior partner, and like only a 24-year-old could do, I just looked at him and said, I don't think this is a good use of my time. And he was stunned. And he said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm just going to go back to doing real estate deals, which is what I was doing in school. And he said, well, why don't you stay here, and we'll do the legal work, and we'll invest in your deals. And so I did that for a year before I went on my own. But those 4 days are the only time I've ever worked for anybody in my life.
What can some young entrepreneurs take away from this story in terms of being able to decide which career path they'll pursue?
Well, I'm a great believer in optionality. I'm a great believer in understanding and observing what's going on. I think it's pretty interesting that I ended up in real estate, but I might have ended up doing something else. But what I was very opportunistic, had a lot of confidence in myself, had a lot of belief that kind of understanding what was going on around me was critical. When I talk about entrepreneurs, I talk about the fact that they're very good at seeing problems. But what the successful entrepreneurs, not only ones who see problems, but see solutions. And for whatever reason, I had that kind of capability. And I also had learned to deal with rejection. Now, one of my summer jobs was as a traveling salesman for a cosmetics company. And for 3 months, everybody just banging me over the head every day, morning to night. And but it was an extraordinary experience because instead of, it's like I talk about entrepreneurs, part of the definition of an entrepreneur is, an entrepreneur doesn't believe that he ever fails. Sometimes it doesn't work out. And sometimes you get up off your rear end and climb the mountain again. But there are no failures. And in the same manner, I think that my career has very much been affected by the fact that I was just driven to keep trying to solve the problems and identify the solutions and then live with the execution.
Really appreciate that, Sam. And about 15 years into your investment career, you made the decision to expand beyond real estate, a pretty big leap. Today, less than half of your investment portfolio remains in real estate. Why did you decide to make this transition, and how did you accomplish it?
Well, again, going back to this theme of simplicity, it was in early 1980. All we had done was real estate, and all of a sudden, the commercial real estate business didn't look so terrific. First of all, people had started to get tax conscious and using real estate to generate tax shelters. We historically had always looked at the tax benefits as what you got paid for the lack of liquidity, not a premium over the intrinsic value. Somebody had also invented the HP-12. And so the commercial real estate industry, think about this because you guys are all technologically competent. In the old days, nobody could afford to spend the time of making a 10-year projection. Or if they did, it would take up a whole week of their time. And all of a sudden, the HP-12 was created and people could make all these projections. And all of a sudden, commercial real estate, which was basically up until that time sold individually, became, a couple of houses in New York were sending out, presentations that were all looked very pretty with hockey stick projections and all done with that. So we looked at that whole arena and felt that at the moment real estate was not very attractive. And so we sat here and my partner and I talked about it, and I said, it just seems to me that the kind of decisions and the kind of criteria that have been so relevant to our success in real estate should really apply across the board. Market share, supply and demand. Just basic things. So why, as long as you weren't going to design rocket engines or biotech or something, why wasn't the same principles that responded to our decision making in real estate apply across the board? And so beginning in 1980, our goal was, to be 50-50 by 90. And what we found was that being a real estate guy in the non-real estate world was really a pretty terrific advantage. When you think about the skill set of real estate people, there probably are no better transactionalists than people who have been in the real estate business, because they literally have lived off making deals. And you all of a sudden found yourself, or I found myself competing with people who didn't have anywhere near the experience that I had in transactions, and gave me the opportunity to do all kinds of things that led to the development. And as long as we kept things relatively simple, there was just unending opportunity. And so we started building a whole series of companies, that some of which we kept for 30 some odd years.
Much of your exponential success came from contrarian investing, and you're known for saying, when everyone else is going left, look right. Can you talk to us about what that means?
Well, I mean, I think that this goes right back to, conventional wisdom. I started with no money. And so I realized very early that if I was going to achieve my objectives, I had to, quote unquote, make capital. And and then it wasn't a very, significant step for me to look at that question and say, if I'm doing the same thing that everybody else is doing, how can I possibly generate the margins necessary to assemble and create capital? And so it became obvious to me that I had to figure out ways that were contrary to everybody else. I mean, competition is really a terrific thing, particularly for you. Me, I like monopolies. And if I can't have monopolies, I'd like oligopolies. But the idea of exposing yourself to common thinking, exposing yourself to conventional wisdom, and assuming that you can, quote unquote, achieve superior results that allows you to, create and amass capital, is, in my judgment, was pretty naive. And it was that determination to identify areas where we didn't have as much competition and where we could distinguish our risk-taking and our judgment as the way to make capital. And that's what we did.
Appreciate it. I'd like to shift focus now to entrepreneurship, and maybe begin by asking, why is entrepreneurship your philanthropic focus? Why is this so important to you, Sam?
Well, maybe the best way to, answer that is that, I've always been, as I said to you a little while ago, I've, only worked for 4 days in my life for anybody else. And I really believe that the development and evolution of the U.S. economy was very much the result of entrepreneurial talent and risk-taking that built this great country and this great machine that we have. And so I've always been, very sensitive to that and been an advocate of that. And in 1979, I was sitting, I had some extra time, and I was reading the curriculum for the University of Michigan Business School. And I couldn't quite figure out what was bothering me until I realized that I had looked at and read the entire curriculum, and the word entrepreneur didn't exist. It wasn't in any single description of a class or anything. It was like like junk science. And so I ended up having a conversation with the dean of the business school, and we led to us developing programs that eventually led to a lot of the programs we've created in the entrepreneurial field.
How do you manage risk, which is inherent to being an entrepreneur? How do you determine what is too risky?
Well, my attitude, there was a very famous investor named Bernard Baruch, who was famous because he sold out in 1929 before the crash. And one of his famous quotes was, "Nobody ever went broke making a profit." And in the same manner, my attitude was always, it can never get, too good, and you can never suffer from too much success. That the essence of risk is the assessment of the downside. And so my orientation has always been an assessment of the downside, so that you can, if you're good at doing that, then you can quantify what the risk is, and how much risk you're taking. And then the question of how much risk you're taking has to connect to what I'll call staying power. The number of people who in my career have fallen by the wayside because they took on too much risk, or they took on the risk that required substance they didn't have to keep it alive. Staying power is the whole thing. So combination of understanding the downside, and then once you've understood the downside, as far as I'm concerned, I had one transaction, which was frankly the best transaction from an investment point of view I ever had, even though we lost money, was because we exactly predicted what the risk was. And before we did it, we had the resources and the staying power to absorb that risk and take that concept to everything else. And that's what has governed how we've handled the word risk.
Appreciate it. I'd like to now shift focus to the topic of building businesses. You've originated and grown a number of multi-billion-dollar businesses across industries. How do you decide which companies to invest in?
Well, again, I go back to Abe Lincoln. But generally, I've identified businesses where I thought it made sense, where scale was possible. The way you build businesses is you begin an idea and you figure out how to use it. I mean, in 1995, we bought a radio station company. At that time, you could own only 17 stations. So the business of owning a radio station company was how you improved the value of those 17 stations. Then in February of 96, the Telecom Deregulation Bill eliminated the 17 station limit. And so we went out and bought 234 stations in 18 months on a kind of a hub and spoke concept. Made sense, and exponentially result. We consolidated the container leasing business. Again, the concept was to separate and not get fooled by the word synergism, and instead really focus on the word redundancy. So in the container leasing situation, every container leasing company had a yard, a manager, and a facility in every major port in the world. When you were number 4, you bought number 3, and you bought number 7, and you became number 1, you eliminated all of that redundancy and produced exponential, results. We've been invested in all kinds of different, businesses, and but they've all been pretty simple stories. Great respect for the risk of execution. That's a very elemental part of building businesses. And to a large extent, we've succeeded because the essence of quote unquote building the business and executing the plan was relatively simple and therefore understandable.
You tend to hold your investments for a long period of time. Could you talk about why is that?
Well, the hardest thing you have is to find opportunities to intelligently invest your capital. So when you, quote, find a business that works and is continuing to work, I don't need to create sales marks to, to pat myself on the back. I just want to be able to keep reinvesting my capital. So Annixter, which we bought January 1st, 1987, and sold in July of 2020. When we bought it, it had 600 million in sales. When we sold it, it had 8.5 billion of sales. And appropriate profitability. So that was just a great business to own, and that's been the case with all the different businesses. And a premature exit usually reflects the fact that it didn't live up to our expectations. To the extent that we hold things for long periods of time, there's nothing better than compounding. Just like the greatest skill in the world is compounding interest. In the same manner, from a capital appreciation point of view, the fact that you don't have to make mark to market at the end of every year means that you defer the tax liability of success, and so you end up with a capital gain at the very end that's been compounded without taxable interference in the meantime.
I'd love to also talk about company culture for a moment. How important is establishing a definable culture within your organization?
Well, that's always been, an integral part of everything I've done. I was interviewing somebody today for a job, and I said to him, the most common scenario is that in these interviews, I tell people that the real problem with EGI, which is the name of our company, is that once you've worked here, it's very difficult to work anywhere else. And what does it mean? It means that the enemy is without. It means that you're creating an environment with accessibility. So, I've got an office, and the door of my office is open and has been for the 33 years I've had that office. And that means that I'm accessible to everybody. And it also means that I have opinions and experiences with everybody. We have a very unique environment, culture, where most of the key people have been here for a very long time. And that allows us to take risk and allows us to make judgments because we have a real assessment of the skill level of the people involved.
There was one funny story. We don't have to talk about it too much, but just between you and I, right? From one of your old videos where you had one executive, one senior guy, you said, left the company, and 6 months later, he came back a little off script, but jokingly. That was really funny, Sam.
Well, he's the only executive that's ever been recruited away.
Yeah.
And when he came back, I asked him, why? I said, you got double the pay and you got a bigger job. And he said, it's very simple. He said, when I worked here, I sat at my desk, and if there was a problem, I got up and I walked over to your office and I laid out the problem and I got the answer. In my new job, I got to write a memo. And then 2 weeks later, I got a response. And he says, that's just not what I wanted to do. And so, but that's very, symptomatic of the environment we've created, an environment where everybody is committed, everybody is directed. Abe Lincoln, also, supposedly assembled a team of rivals. I think that's a very interesting concept, but I don't want to run an entrepreneurial environment by a team of rivals. I want to, in effect, understand that the competitor is outside, and we want to create a strong and internal environment that we're able to deal with the competitors that way, not compete against each other.
Let's circle back to your book now for a quick sec, where it includes Samisms that captures a lot of your work and life principles that you've developed throughout your life. Let's cover just a couple of them. We suffer from knowing the numbers. What does this mean, and how can it save someone from costly mistakes?
I don't know about the mistakes. but the concept is very simple. And again, it's the same theme about conventional wisdom. I came up with that concept in the late 70s when people were buying real estate and I just didn't understand it. And the only way I could conclude was that I suffered from knowing the numbers, therefore I couldn't do that. And of course, it turned out that I was right. But it's self-confidence, it's understanding the principles under which you are doing things and sticking to your guns.
Now, this is my favorite one we're getting into of the night. Personal favorite story I've ever heard probably in 21 years. So I'm very excited to ask this one. So negotiating is not a zero-sum game. Why has it played such an important part in building your empire? And this is the story. Can you talk about the time when you were negotiating with Merrill Lynch? This is just amazing, where they offered you a price on a property and you countered with the lower price and they thought like they were hearing crazy things. That's my favorite story.
Well, that was, we were really doing an underwriting of a convertible debt issue. And we ended up, concluding that the book said that we could do the deal at 6.5%. And I said, well, then that means we could do it at 6 3/4. And they said, well, I don't know. They said, well, no, we said 6.5. And I said, yeah, but I'd rather have a situation where every single person who bought this issue had a profit on day one. And, the extra quarter didn't cost me much, but built up an enormous amount of goodwill. And in the same manner, as somebody who's negotiated deals all his life, the key to doing everything is to understand, what your deal breakers are, and more important, what the other person's deal breakers are. And to the extent that you can satisfy his needs and not, trip your own deal breaker scenario, you can make a lot of deals. And as opposed to some people who believe that, if I win, you got to lose. My attitude has always been the fact that I win is terrific. It's even better if both of us win. And so, in effect, we've done transactions where more than anything else, the ultimate standard is that we've done more than one transaction with the same people. And that means that, that they were treated fairly on either side.
Very, very well said. Truly a personal favorite story. So who are your mentors in your early career and what did you learn from them?
Well, probably, obviously we all have lots of mentors. I had, my father was certainly, set an example for me. And there was a guy named Jay Pritzker, who was probably the smartest guy I ever met. And I learned discipline from them. Jay was particularly good at taking very complex situations and simplifying them. I mean, that's really a consistent theme, the simplification. If you can make it simple, if you can break it down, then you can better understand it and you can mitigate risk accordingly.
Thank you for that. What can young entrepreneurs today do to better inform their worldview and gain a macro perspective?
I can only answer that question by telling you what I do. I'm a voluminous reader. I read 5 newspapers a day. I read 3 magazines a week. I'm constantly reading and educating myself and exposing myself to more and more information. And the more that that's the case, the more likely I'm to make informed decisions. So I'm just suck it all up. I love information, and I somehow have the ability to connect the information and recall it when it's appropriate to a decision.
And what advice would you have for someone starting their own real estate investment firm?
Well, I think the themes have been, pretty prevalent in this conversation tonight. Simplicity, respect for execution, staying power, understanding the downside. These are all, elements that come into assessing the risk and implementing it accordingly.
So what traits define a successful person, regardless of what stage they are in their career?
Self-confidence, clarity. There have been a lot of very brilliant people in my career who, in effect, overcomplicated everything, and the result was that that they didn't really accomplish anywhere near as much as they should have. And so that's really, that's what you look for. You look for people who are confident. You look for people who can simplify things, and respect and humility. I mean, the 11th commandment is, "Thou shalt not take oneself seriously," and I strongly believe in that.
And now this last one, I want everyone in the audience to listen very carefully to the answer. Sam, what do you ask potential new hires in their interviews?
Obviously, I ask them all kinds of stuff, but the one thing that I ask them is, are you hungry? Because in the end, there's some kind of a minimum intellectual quotient necessary to achieve, but you don't need 190 IQ or anything like that. What you need is motivation. And when I'm interviewing somebody, the single most important thing I'm trying to understand is, how motivated are they? And if they're appropriately motivated, then I can create the opportunity for them to extend it and achieve success.
Thank you for that, Sam. It's been an absolute honor, a pleasure to have you today. I couldn't thank you enough for being here with us.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you.
Good night.